The Habits of Successful Organizations. Keystone Habits, or the Ballad of Paul O'Neill. Which habits matter most? On a blustery October day in 1987, a herd of prominent Wall Street investors and stock analysts gathered in the ballroom of a posh Manhattan hotel. They were there to meet the new CEO of the Aluminum Company of America, or Alcoa, as it was known, a corporation that, for nearly a century, had manufactured everything from the foil that wraps Hershey's Kisses and the metal in Coca-Cola cans to the bolts that hold satellites together. Alcoa's founder had invented the process for smelting aluminum a century earlier, and since then the company had become one of the largest on Earth. Many of the people in the audience had invested millions in Alcoa stock and had enjoyed a steady return. In the past year, however, investor grumblings started. Alcoa's management had made misstep after misstep, unwisely trying to expand into new product lines while competitors stole customers and profits away. So there had been a palpable sense of relief when Alcoa's board announced it was time for new leadership. That relief, though, turned to unease when the choice was announced. The new CEO would be a former government bureaucrat named Paul O'Neill. Many on Wall Street had never heard of him. When Alcoa scheduled this meet and greet at the Manhattan Ballroom, every major investor asked for an invitation. A few minutes before noon, O'Neill took the stage. He was 1 years old, trim, and dressed in gray pinstripes and a red power tie. His hair was white and his posture military straight. He bounced up the steps and smiled warmly. He looked dignified, solid, confident. Like a chief executive. Then he opened his mouth. "I want to talk to you about worker safety," he said. "Every year, numerous Alcoa workers are injured so badly that they miss a day of work. Our safety record is better than the general American workforce, especially considering that our employees work with metals that are 1,500 degrees and machines that can rip a man's arm off. But it's not good enough. I intend to make Alcoa the safest company in America. I intend to go for 0 injuries." The audience was confused. These meetings usually followed a predictable script. A new CEO would start with an introduction, make a faux self-deprecating joke, something about how he slept his way through Harvard Business School, then promise to boost profits and lower costs. Next would come an excoriation of taxes, business regulations, and sometimes, with a fervor that suggested first-hand experience in divorce court, lawyers. Finally, the speech would end with a blizzard of buzzwords, synergy, right-sizing, and co-opetition, at which point everyone could return to their offices, reassured that capitalism was safe for another day. O'Neill hadn't said anything about profits. He didn't mention taxes. There was no talk of using alignment to achieve a win-win in synergistic market advantage. For all anyone in the audience knew. Given his talk of worker safety, O'Neill might be pro-regulation. It was a terrifying prospect. "Now, before I go any further," O'Neill said, "I want to point out the safety exits in this room." He gestured to the rear of the ballroom. "There's a couple of doors in the back, and in the unlikely event of a fire or other emergency, you should calmly walk out, go down the stairs to the lobby, and leave the building." Silence. The only noise was the hum of traffic through the windows. Safety. Fire exits. Was this a joke? One investor in the audience knew that O'Neill had been in Washington, D.C., during the 60s. Guy must have done a lot of drugs, he thought. Eventually, someone raised a hand and asked about inventories in the aerospace division. Another asked about the company's capital ratios. "I'm not certain you heard me," O'Neill said. "If you want to understand how Alcoa is doing, you need to look at our workplace safety figures. If we bring our injury rates down, it won't be because of cheerleading or the nonsense you sometimes hear from other CEOs. It will be because the individuals at this company have agreed to become part of something important. They've devoted themselves to creating a habit of excellence. Safety will be an indicator that we're making progress in changing our habits across the entire institution." That's how we should be judged. The investors in the room almost stampeded out the doors when the presentation ended. One jogged to the lobby, found a pay phone, and called his 20 largest clients. I said, "The board put a crazy hippie in charge and he's going to kill the company," that investor told me. I ordered them to sell their stock immediately, before everyone else in the room started calling their clients and telling them the same thing. It was literally the worst piece of advice I gave in my entire career. Within a year of O'Neill's speech, Alcoa's Profit would hit a record high. By the time O'Neill retired in 2000, the company's annual net income was 5 times larger than before he arrived, and its market capitalization had risen by $27 billion. Someone who invested $1 million in Alcoa on the day O'Neill was hired would have earned another $1 million in dividends while he headed the company, and the value of their stock would be 5 times bigger when he left. What's more, all that growth occurred while Alcoa became one of the safest companies in the world. Before O'Neill's arrival, almost every Alcoa plant had at least one accident per week. Once his safety plan was implemented, some facilities would go years without a single employee losing a workday due to an accident. The company's worker injury rate fell to 1/20 the U.S. average. So how did O'Neill make one of the largest, stodgiest, and most potentially dangerous companies into a profit machine and a bastion of safety? By attacking one habit and then watching the changes ripple through the organization. I knew I had to transform Alcoa, O'Neill told me. But you can't order people to change. That's not how the brain works. So I decided I was going to start by focusing on one thing. If I could start disrupting the habits around one thing, it would spread throughout the entire company. O'Neill believed that some habits have the power to start a chain reaction, changing other habits as they move through an organization. Some habits, in other words, matter more than others in remaking businesses and lives. These are keystone habits, and they can influence how people work, eat, play, live, spend, and communicate. Keystone habits start a process that, over time, transforms everything. Keystone habits say that success doesn't depend on getting every 101 single thing right, but instead relies on identifying a few key priorities and fashioning them into powerful levers. This book's 5RST section explained how habits work, how they can be created and changed. However, where should a would-be habit master start? Understanding keystone habits holds the answer to that question. The habits that matter most are the ones that, when they start to shift, dislodge and remake other patterns. Keystone habits explain how Michael Phelps became an Olympic champion and why some college students outperform their peers. They describe why some people, after years of trying, suddenly lose 40 pounds while becoming more productive at work and still getting home in time for dinner with their kids. And keystone habits explain how Alcoa became one of the best performing stocks in the Dow Jones Index, while also becoming one of the safest places on earth. When Alcoa 5RST approached O'Neill about becoming CEO, he wasn't sure he wanted the job. He'd already earned plenty of money, and his wife liked Connecticut, where they lived. They didn't know anything about Pittsburgh, where Alcoa was headquartered. But before turning down the offer, O'Neill asked for some time to think it over. To help himself make the decision, he started working on a list of what would be his biggest priorities if he accepted the post. O'Neill had always been a big believer in lists. Lists were how he organized his life. In college at Fresno State, here he finished his courses in a bit over 3 years, while also working 30 hours a week. O'Neill had drafted a list of everything he hoped to accomplish during his lifetime, including, near the top, make a difference. After graduating in 1960, at a friend's encouragement, O'Neill picked up an application for a federal internship and, along with 300,000 others, took the government employment exam. 3,000 people were chosen for interviews. 300 of them were offered jobs. O'Neill was one. He started as a middle manager at the Veterans Administration and was told to learn about computer systems. All the while, O'Neill kept writing his lists, recording why some projects were more successful than others, which contractors delivered on time and which didn't. He was promoted each year. And as he rose through the VA's ranks, he made a name for himself as someone whose lists always seemed to include a bullet point that got a problem solved. By the mid-1960s, such skills were in high demand in Washington, D.C. Robert McNamara had recently remade the Pentagon by hiring a crop of young mathematicians, statisticians, and computer programmers. President Johnson wanted some whiz kids of his own. So O'Neill was recruited to what eventually became known as the OFFICE of Management and Budget, one of D.C.'s most powerful agencies. Within a decade, at age 38, he was promoted to deputy director and was, suddenly, among the most influential people in town. That's when O'Neill's education in organizational habits really started. One of his FIRST assignments was to create an analytical framework for studying how the government was spending money on health care. He quickly figured out that the government's efforts, which should have been guided by logical rules and deliberate priorities, were instead driven by bizarre institutional processes that, in many ways, operated like habits. Bureaucrats and politicians, rather than making decisions, were responding to cues with automatic routines in order to get rewards such as promotions or re-election. It was the habit loop spread across thousands of people and billions of dollars. For instance, after World War II, Congress had created a program to build community hospitals. A quarter century later, it was still chugging along, and so whenever lawmakers allocated new HLCR funds, bureaucrats immediately started building. The towns where the new hospitals were located didn't necessarily need more patient beds, but that didn't matter. What mattered was erecting a big structure that a politician could point to while stumping for votes. Federal workers would spend months debating blue or yellow curtains, figuring out if patient rooms should contain 1 or 2 televisions, designing nurses' stations, real pointless stuff, O'Neill told me. Most of the time, no one ever asked if the town wanted a hospital. The bureaucrats had gotten into a habit of solving every medical problem by building something so that a congressman could say, "Here's what I did." It didn't make any sense, but everybody did the same thing again and again. Researchers have found institutional habits in almost every organization or company they've scrutinized. Individuals have habits, groups have routines, wrote the academic Jeffrey Hodgson, who spent a career examining organizational patterns. Routines are the organizational analog of habits. To O'Neill, these kinds of habits seemed dangerous. We were basically ceding decision-making to a process that occurred without actually thinking, O'Neill said. But at other agencies, where change was in the air, good organizational habits were creating success. Some departments at NASA, for instance, were overhauling themselves by deliberately instituting organizational routines that encouraged engineers to take more risks. When unmanned rockets exploded on takeoff, department heads would applaud, so that everyone would know their division had tried and failed, but at least they had tried. Eventually, Mission Control Phi led with applause every time something expensive blew up. It became an organizational habit. Or take the Environmental Protection Agency, which was created in 1970. The EPA's FIRST administrator, William Ruckelshaus, consciously engineered organizational habits that encouraged his regulators to be aggressive on enforcement. When lawyers asked for permission to file a lawsuit or enforcement action, it went through a process for approval. The default was authorization to go ahead. The message was clear: at the EPA, aggression gets rewarded. By 1975, the EPA was issuing more than 1,500 new environmental rules a year. Every time I looked at a different part of the government, I found these habits that seemed to explain why things were either succeeding or failing, O'Neill told me. The best agencies understood the importance of routines. The worst agencies were headed by people who never thought about it, and then wondered why no one followed their orders. In 1977, after 16 years in Washington, D.C., O'Neill decided it was time to leave. He was working 15 hours a day, 7 days a week, and his wife was tired of raising 4 children on her own. O'Neill resigned and landed a job with international paper, the world's largest pulp and paper company. He eventually became its president. By then, some of his old government friends were on Alcoa's board. When the company needed a new chief executive, they thought of him, which is how he ended up writing a list of his priorities if he decided to take the job. At the time, Alcoa was struggling. Critics said the company's workers weren't nimble enough and the quality of its products was poor. But at the top of O'Neill's list he didn't write quality or efficiency as his biggest priorities. At a company as big and as old as Alcoa, you can't flip a switch and expect everyone to work harder or produce more. The previous CEO had tried to mandate improvements, and 15,000 employees had gone on strike. It got so bad they would bring dummies to the parking lots, dress them like managers, and burn them in FEGY. Alcoa was not a happy family, one person from that period told me. It was more like the Manson family, but with the addition of molten metal. O'Neill figured his top priority, if he took the job, would have to be something that everybody, unions and executives, would agree was important. He needed a focus that would bring people together, that would give him leverage to change how people worked and communicated. I went to basics, he told me. Everyone deserves to leave work as safely as they arrive, right? You shouldn't be scared that feeding your family is going to kill you. That's what I decided to focus on, changing everyone's safety habits. At the top of O'Neill's list he wrote down safety and set an audacious goal, 0 injuries. Not 0 factory injuries. 0 injuries, period. That would be his commitment no matter how much it cost. O'Neill decided to take the job. I'm really glad to be here, O'Neill told a room full of workers at a smelting plant in Tennessee a few months after he was hired. Not everything had gone smoothly. Wall Street was still panicked. The unions were concerned. Some of Alcoa's vice presidents were miffed at being passed over for the top job. And O'Neill kept talking about worker safety. I'm happy to negotiate with you about anything, O'Neill said. He was on a tour of Alcoa's American plants, after which he was 106. Going to visit the company's facilities in 31 other countries. But there's one thing I'm never going to negotiate with you, and that's safety. I don't ever want you to say that we haven't taken every step to make sure people don't get hurt. If you want to argue with me about that, you're going to lose. The brilliance of this approach was that no one, of course, wanted to argue with O'Neill about worker safety. Unions had been fighting for better safety rules for years. Managers didn't want to argue about it, either, since injuries meant lost productivity and low morale. What most people didn't realize, however, was that O'Neill's plan for getting to 0 injuries entailed the most radical realignment in Alcoa's history. The key to protecting Alcoa employees, O'Neill believed, was understanding why injuries happened in the first place. And to understand why injuries happened, you had to study how the manufacturing process was going wrong. To understand how things were going wrong, you had to bring in people who could educate workers about quality control and the most efficient work processes, so that it would be easier to do everything right, since correct work is also safer work. In other words, to protect workers, Alcoa needed to become the best, most streamlined aluminum company on earth. O'Neill's safety plan, in effect, was modeled on the habit loop. He identified a simple cue, an employee injury. He instituted an automatic routine. Anytime someone was injured, the unit president had to report it to O'Neill within 24 hours and present a plan for making sure the injury never happened again. And there was a reward. The only people who got promoted were those who embraced the system. Unit presidents were busy people. To contact O'Neill within 24 hours of an injury, they needed to hear about an accident from their vice presidents as soon as it happened. So vice presidents needed to be in constant communication with FLUR managers. And FLUR managers needed to get workers to raise warnings as soon as they saw a problem and keep a list of suggestions nearby, so that when the vice president asked for a plan, there was an idea box already full of possibilities. To make all of that happen, each unit had to build new communication systems that made it easier for the lowliest worker to get an idea to the loftiest executive, as fast as possible. Almost everything about the company's rigid hierarchy had to change to accommodate O'Neill's safety program. He was building new corporate habits. As Alcoa's safety patterns shifted, other aspects of the company started changing with startling speed, as well. Rules that unions had spent decades opposing, such as measuring the productivity of individual workers, WR suddenly embraced, because such measurements helped everyone figure out when part of the manufacturing process was getting out of whack, posing a safety risk. Policies that managers had long resisted, such as giving workers autonomy to shut down a production line when the pace became overwhelming, were now welcomed, because that was the best way to stop injuries before they occurred. The company shifted so much that some employees found safety habits spilling into other parts of their lives. 2 or 3 years ago, I'm in my OFFICE, looking at the 9th Street Bridge out the window, and there's some guys working who aren't using correct safety procedures, said Jeff Shockey, Alcoa's current safety director. One of them was standing on top of the bridge's guardrail, while the other held onto his belt. They weren't using safety harnesses or ropes. They work for some company that has nothing to do with us, but without thinking about it, I got out of my chair, went down 5 flights of stairs, walked over the bridge and told these guys, "Hey, you're risking your life, you have to use your harness and safety gear." The men explained their supervisor had forgotten to bring the equipment. So Shockey called the local Occupational Safety and Health Administration OFFICE and turned the supervisor in. Another executive told me that one day, he stopped at a street excavation near his house because they didn't have a trench box, and gave everyone a lecture on the importance of proper procedures. It was the weekend, and he stopped his car, with his kids in the back, to lecture city workers about trench safety. That isn't natural, but that's kind of the point. We do this stuff without thinking about it now. O'Neill never promised that his focus on worker safety would increase Alcoa's profits. However, as his new routines moved through the organization, costs came down, quality went up, and productivity skyrocketed. If molten metal was injuring workers when it splashed, then the pouring system was redesigned, which led to fewer injuries. It also saved money because Alcoa lost fewer raw materials in spills. If a machine kept breaking down, it was replaced, which meant there was less risk of a broken gear snagging an employee's arm. It also meant higher quality products because, as Alcoa discovered, equipment malfunctions were a chief cause of subpar aluminum. Researchers have found similar dynamics in dozens of other settings, including individuals' lives. Take, for instance, studies from the past decade examining the impacts of exercise on daily routines. When people start habitually exercising, even as infrequently as once a week, they start changing other, unrelated patterns in their lives, often unknowingly. Typically, people who exercise start eating better and becoming more productive at work. They smoke less and show more patience with colleagues and family. They use their credit cards less frequently and say they feel less stressed. It's not completely clear why. But for many people, exercise is a keystone habit that triggers widespread change. Exercise spills over, said James Prochaska, a University of Rhode Island researcher. There's something about it that makes other good habits easier. Studies have documented that families who habitually eat dinner together seem to raise children with better homework skills, higher grades, greater emotional control, and more confidence. Making your bed every morning is correlated with better productivity, a greater sense of well-being, and stronger skills at sticking with a budget. It's not that a family meal or a tidy bed causes better grades or less frivolous spending. But somehow those initial shifts start chain reactions that help other good habits take hold. If you focus on changing or cultivating keystone habits, you can cause widespread shifts. However, identifying keystone habits is tricky. To find them, you have to know where to look. Detecting keystone habits means searching out certain characteristics. Keystone habits offer what is known within academic literature as small wins. They help other habits to flourish by creating new structures, and they establish cultures where change becomes contagious. But as O'Neill and countless others have found, crossing the gap between understanding those principles and using them requires a bit of ingenuity. When Michael Phelps's alarm clock went off at 6:30 a.m. on the morning of August 13, 2008, he crawled out of bed in the Olympic Village in Beijing and fell right into his routine. He pulled on a pair of sweatpants and walked to breakfast. He had already won 3 gold medals earlier that week, giving him 9 in his CR. ND had 2 races that day. By 7 a.m., he was in the cafeteria, eating his regular RSTI menu of eggs, oatmeal, and 4 energy shakes, the RST of more than 6,000 calories he would consume over the next 16 hours. Phelps's first race, the 200-meter butterfly, his strongest event, was scheduled for 10 o'clock. 2 hours before the starting gun fired, he began his usual stretching regime, starting with his arms, then his back, then working down to his ankles, which were so flexible they could extend more than 90 degrees, farther than a ballerina's endpoint. At 8:30, he slipped into the pool and began his first warm UP lap, 800 meters of mixed styles, followed by 600 meters of kicking, 400 meters pulling a buoy between his legs, 200 meters of stroke drills, and a series of 25-meter sprints to elevate his heart rate. The workout took precisely 5 VE minutes. At 9:15, he exited the pool and started squeezing into his LZR Racer, a bodysuit so tight it required 20 minutes of tugging to put it on. Then he clamped headphones over his ears, cranked up the hip-hop mix he played before every race, and waited. Phelps had started swimming when he was 7 years old to burn off some of the energy that was driving his mom and teachers crazy. When a local swimming coach named Bob Bowman saw Phelps's long torso, big hands, and relatively short legs, which offered less drag in the water, he knew Phelps could become a champion. But Phelps was emotional. He had trouble calming down before races. His parents were divorcing, and he had problems coping with the stress. Bowman purchased a book of relaxation exercises and asked Phelps's mom to read them aloud every night. The book contained a script: tighten your right hand into a fist and release it. Imagine the tension melting away, that tensed and relaxed each part of Phelps's body before he fell asleep. Bowman believed that for swimmers, the key to victory was creating the right routines. Phelps, Bowman knew, had a perfect physique for the pool. That said, everyone who eventually competes at the Olympics has perfect musculature. Bowman could also see that Phelps, even at a young age, had a capacity for obsessiveness that made him an ideal athlete. Then again, all elite performers are obsessives. What Bowman could give Phelps, however, what would set him apart from other competitors, were habits that would make him the strongest mental swimmer in the pool. He didn't need to control every aspect of Phelps's life. All he needed to do was target a few specified habits that had nothing to do with swimming and everything to do with creating the right mindset. He designed a series of behaviors that Phelps could use to become calm and focused before each race, to find those tiny advantages that, in a sport where victory can come in milliseconds, would make all the difference. When Phelps was a teenager, for instance, at the end of each practice, Bowman would tell him to go home and watch the videotape. Watch it before you go to sleep and when you wake up. The videotape wasn't real. Rather, it was a mental visualization of the perfect race. Each night before falling asleep and each morning after waking up, Phelps would imagine himself jumping off the blocks and, in slow motion, swimming flawlessly. He would visualize his strokes, the walls of the pool, his turns, and the finish. He would imagine the wake behind his body, the water dripping off his lips as his mouth cleared the surface, what it would feel like to rip off his cap at the end. He would lie in bed with his eyes shut and watch the entire competition, the smallest details, again and again, until he knew each second by heart. During practices, when Bowman ordered Phelps to swim at race speed, he would shout, "Put in the videotape," and Phelps would push himself, as hard as he could. It almost felt anticlimactic as he cut through the water. He had done this so many times in his head that, by now, it felt rote. But it worked. He got faster and faster. Even. Toolly, all Bowman had to do before a race was whisper, "Get the videotape ready," and Phelps would settle down and crush the competition. And once Bowman established a few core routines in Phelps's life, all the other habits, his diet and practice schedules, the stretching and sleep routines, seemed to fall into place on their own. At the core of why those habits were so effective, why they acted as keystone habits, was something known within academic literature as a small win. Small wins are exactly what they sound like, and are part of how keystone habits create widespread changes. A huge body of research has shown that small wins have enormous power, and influence disproportionate to the accomplishments of the victories themselves. Small wins are a steady application of a small advantage, one Cornell professor wrote in 1984. Once a small win has been accomplished, forces are set in motion that favor another small win. Small wins fuel transformative changes by leveraging tiny advantages into patterns that convince people that bigger achievements are within reach. For example, when gay rights organizations started campaigning against homophobia in the late 1960s, their initial efforts yielded only a string of failures. They pushed to repeal laws used to prosecute gays and were roundly defeated in state legislatures. Teachers tried to create curriculums to counsel gay teens, and were fired for suggesting that homosexuality should be embraced. It seemed like the gay community's larger goals, ending discrimination and police harassment, convincing the American Psychiatric Association to stop defining homosexuality as a mental disease, were out of reach. Then, in the early 1970s, the American Library Association's task force on gay liberation decided to focus on one modest goal: convincing the Library of Congress to reclassify books about the gay liberation movement from HQ 71 to 471, abnormal sexual relations, including sexual crimes, to another, less pejorative category. In 1972, after receiving a letter requesting the reclassification, the Library of Congress agreed to make the shift, reclassifying books into a newly created category, HQ 76.5, homosexuality, lesbianism, GI liberation movement, homophile movement. It was a minor tweak of an old institutional habit regarding how books were shelved, but the effect was electrifying. News of the new policy spread across the nation. Gay rights organizations, citing the victory, started FUNDR-acing drives. Within a few years, openly gay politicians were running for political office in California, New York, Massachusetts, and Oregon, many of them citing the Library of Congress's decision as inspiration. In 1973, the American Psychiatric Association, after years of internal debate, rewrote the definition of homosexuality so it was no longer a mental illness, paving the way for the passage of state laws that made it illegal to discriminate against people because of their sexual orientation. And it all began with one small win. Small wins do not combine in a neat, linear, serial form, with each step being a demonstrable step closer to some predetermined goal, wrote Carl Weick, a prominent organizational psychologist. More common is the circumstance where small wins are scattered like miniature experiments that test implicit theories about resistance and opportunity and uncover both resources and barriers that were invisible before the situation was stirred up. Which is precisely what happened with Michael Phelps. When Bob Bowman started working with Phelps and his mother on the keystone habits of visualization and relaxation, neither Bowman nor Phelps had any idea what they were doing. We'd experiment, try different things until we found stuff that worked, Bowman told me. Eventually we figured out it was best to concentrate on these tiny moments of success and build them into mental triggers. We worked them into a routine. There's a series of things we do before every race that are designed to give Michael a sense of building victory. If you were to ask Michael what's going on in his head before competition, he would say he's not really thinking about anything. He's just following the program. But that's not right. It's more like his habits have taken over. When the race arrives, he's more than halfway through his plan and he's been victorious at every step. All the stretches went like he planned. The warm-up laps were just like he visualized. His headphones are playing exactly what he expected. The actual race is just another step in a pattern that started earlier that day and has been nothing but victories. Winning is a natural extension. Back in Beijing, it was 9:56 a.m., 4 minutes before the race's start, and Phelps stood behind his starting block, bouncing slightly on his toes. When the announcer said his name, Phelps stepped onto the block, as he always did before a race, and then stepped down, as he always did. He swung his arms 3 times, as he had before every race since he was 12 years old. He stepped up on the blocks again, got into his stance, and, when the gun sounded, leapt. Phelps knew that something was wrong as soon as he hit the water. There was moisture inside his goggles. He couldn't tell if they were leaking from the top or bottom, but as he broke the water's surface and began swimming, he hoped the leak wouldn't become too bad. By the second turn, however, everything was getting blurry. As he approached the third turn and final lap, the cups of his goggles were completely lead. Phelps couldn't see anything. Not the line along the pool's bottom, not the black T marking the approaching wall. He couldn't see how many strokes were left. For most swimmers, losing your sight in the middle of an Olympic final would be cause for panic. 115. Phelps was calm. Everything else that day had gone according to plan. The leaking goggles were a minor deviation, but one for which he was prepared. Bowman had once made Phelps swim in a Michigan pool in the dark, believing that he needed to be ready for any surprise. Some of the videotapes in Phelps's mind had featured problems like this. He had mentally rehearsed how he would respond to a goggle failure. As he started his last lap, Phelps estimated how many strokes the final push would require, and in a teen or 20, maybe T21, and started counting. He felt totally relaxed as he swam at full strength. Midway through the lap he began to increase his effort, a final eruption that had become one of his main techniques in overwhelming opponents. At 18 strokes, he started anticipating the wall. He could hear the crowd roaring, but since he was blind, he had no idea if they were cheering for him or someone else. 19 strokes, then 20. It felt like he needed one more. That's what the videotape in his head said. He made a T25 RST, huge stroke, glided with his arm outstretched, and touched the wall. He had timed it perfectly. When he ripped off his goggles and looked up at the scoreboard, it said WR, World Record, next to his name. He'd won another gold. After the race, a reporter asked what it had felt like to swim blind. "It felt like I imagined it would," Phelps said. It was one additional victory in a lifetime full of small wins. 6 months after Paul O'Neill became CEO of Alcoa, he got a telephone call in the middle of the night. A plant manager in Arizona was on the line, panicked, talking about how an extrusion press had stopped operating and one of the workers, a young man who had joined the company a few weeks earlier, eager for the job because it offered health care for his pregnant wife, had tried a repair. He had jumped over a yellow safety wall surrounding the press and walked across the pit. There was a piece of aluminum jammed into the hinge on a swinging 6-foot arm. The young man pulled on the aluminum scrap, removing it. The machine was XED. Behind him, the arm restarted its arc, swinging toward his head. When it hit, the arm crushed his skull. He was killed instantly. 14 hours later, O'Neill ordered all the plant's executives, as well as Alcoa's top officers in Pittsburgh, into an emergency meeting. For much of the day, they painstakingly recreated the accident with diagrams and by watching videotapes again and again. They identified dozens of errors that had contributed to the death, including 2 managers who had seen the man jump over the barrier but failed to stop him, a training program that hadn't emphasized to the man that he wouldn't be blamed for a breakdown, lack of instructions that he should find a manager before attempting a repair, and the absence of sensors to automatically shut down the machine when someone stepped into the pit. "We killed this man," a grim-faced O'Neill told the group. "It's my failure of leadership. I caused his death. And it's the failure of all of you in the chain of command." The executives in the room were taken aback. Sure, a tragic accident had occurred, but tragic accidents were part of life at Alcoa. It was a huge company with employees who handled red, hot metal and dangerous machines. Paul had come in as an outsider, and there was a lot of skepticism when he talked about safety, said Bill O'Rourke, a top executive. We figured it would last a few weeks, and then he would start focusing on something else. But that meeting really shook everyone up. He was serious about this stuff, serious enough that he would stay up nights worrying about some employee he'd never met. That's when things started to change. Within a week of that meeting, all the safety railings at Alcoa's plants were repainted bright yellow, and new policies were written up. Managers told employees not to be afraid to suggest proactive maintenance, and rules were clarified so that no one would attempt unsafe repairs. The newfound vigilance resulted in a short-term, noticeable decline in the injury rate. Alcoa experienced a small win. Then O'Neill pounced. I want to congratulate everyone for bringing down the number of accidents, even just for 2 weeks, he wrote in a memo that made its way through the entire company. We shouldn't celebrate because we've followed the rules, or brought down a number. We should celebrate because we are saving lives. Workers made copies of the note and taped it to their lockers. Someone painted a mural of O'Neill on one of the walls of a smelting plant with a quote from the memo inscribed underneath. Just as Michael Phelps's routines had nothing to do with swimming and everything to do with his success, so O'Neill's efforts began snowballing into changes that were unrelated to safety, but transformative nonetheless. I said to the hourly workers, if your management doesn't follow up on safety issues, then call me at home. Here's my number, O'Neill told me. Workers started calling, but they didn't want to talk about accidents. They wanted to talk about all these other great ideas. The Alcoa plant that manufactured aluminum siding for houses, for instance, had been struggling for years because executives would try to anticipate popular colors and inevitably guess wrong. They would pay consultants millions of dollars to choose shades of paint, and 6 months later, the warehouse would be overflowing with sunburst yellow and out of suddenly in demand hunter green. One day, a low-level employee made a suggestion that quickly worked its way to the general manager. If they grouped all the painting machines together, they could switch out the pigments faster and become more nimble in responding to shifts in customer demand. Within a year, profits on aluminum siding doubled. The small wins that started with O'Neill's focus on safety created a climate in which all kinds of new ideas bubbled up. It turns out this guy had been suggesting this painting idea for a decade, but hadn't told anyone in management, an Alcoa executive told me. Then he figures, since we keep on asking for safety recommendations, why not tell them about this other idea? It was like he gave us the winning lottery numbers. When a young Paul O'Neill was working for the government and creating a framework for analyzing federal spending on health care, one of the foremost issues concerning OFFI-SIALs was infant mortality. The United States, at the time, was one of the wealthiest countries on Earth. Yet it had a higher infant mortality rate than most of Europe and some parts of South America. Rural areas, in particular, saw a staggering number of babies die before their first birthdays. O'Neill was tasked with figuring out why. He asked other federal agencies to start analyzing infant mortality data, and each time someone came back with an answer, he'd ask another question, trying to get deeper, to understand the problem's root causes. Whenever someone came into O'Neill's OFFICE with some discovery, O'Neill would start interrogating them with new inquiries. He drove people crazy with his never-ending push to learn more, to understand what was really going on. I love Paul O'Neill, but you could not pay me enough to work for him again, one OFFI SIAL told me. The man has never encountered an answer he can't turn into another 20 hours of work. Some research, for instance, suggested that the biggest cause of infant deaths was premature births. And the reason babies were born too early was that mothers suffered from malnourishment during pregnancy. So to lower infant mortality, improve mothers' diets. Simple, right? But to stop malnourishment, women had to improve their diets before they became pregnant. which meant the government had to start educating women about nutrition before they became sexually active, which meant OFFI-SIALs had to create nutrition curriculums inside high schools. However, when O'Neill began asking about how to create those curriculums, he discovered that many high school teachers in rural areas didn't know enough basic biology to teach nutrition. So the government had to remake how teachers were getting educated in college and give them a stronger grounding in biology so they could eventually teach nutrition to teenage girls, so those teenagers would eat better before they started having sex, and, eventually, be sufficiently nourished when they had children. Poor teacher training, the OFFI-SIALs working with O'Neill finally figured out, was a root cause of high infant mortality. If you asked doctors or public health OFFI-SIALs for a plan to fight GHT infant deaths, none of them would have suggested changing how teachers are trained. They wouldn't have known there was a link. However, by teaching college students about biology, you made it possible for them to eventually pass on that knowledge to teenagers, who started eating healthier, and years later give birth to stronger babies. Today, the U.S. infant mortality rate is 68% lower than when O'Neill started the job. O'Neill's experiences with infant mortality illustrate the second way that Keystone habits encourage change, by creating structures that help other habits to flourish. In the case of premature deaths, changing collegiate curriculums for teachers started a chain reaction that eventually trickled down to how girls were educated in rural areas and whether they were sufficiently nourished when they became pregnant. And O'Neill's habit of constantly pushing other bureaucrats to continue researching until they found a problem's root causes overhauled how the government thought about problems like infant mortality. The same thing can happen in people's lives. For example, until about 20 years ago, conventional wisdom held that the best way for people to lose weight was to radically alter their lives. Doctors would give obese patients strict diets and tell them to join a gym, attend regular counseling sessions, sometimes as often as every day, and shift their daily routines by walking upstairs, for instance, instead of taking the elevator. Only by completely shaking up someone's life, the thinking went, could their bad habits be reformed. But when researchers studied the effectiveness of these methods over prolonged periods, they discovered they were failures. Patients would use the stairs for a few weeks, but by the end of the month, it was too much hassle. They began diets and joined gyms, but after the initial burst of enthusiasm wore off, they slid back into their old eating and TV watching habits. Piling on so much change at once made it impossible for any of it to stick. Then, in 2009, a group of researchers funded by the National Institutes of Health published a study of a different approach to weight loss. They had assembled a group of 1,600 obese people and asked them to concentrate on writing down everything they ate at least one day per week. It was hard at first. The subjects forgot to carry their food journals, or would snack and not note it. Slowly, however, people started recording their meals once a week and sometimes, more often. Many participants started keeping a daily food log. Eventually, it became a habit. Then, something unexpected happened. The participants started looking at their entries and finding patterns they didn't know existed. Some noticed they always seemed to snack at about 10 a.m., so they began keeping an apple or banana on their desks for mid-morning munchies. Others started using their journals to plan future menus, and when dinner rolled around, they ate the healthy meal they had written down, rather than junk food from the fridge. The researchers hadn't suggested any of these behaviors. They had simply asked everyone to write down what they ate once a week. But this Keystone habit food journaling created a structure that helped other habits to flourish. 6 months into the study, people who kept daily food records had lost twice as much weight as everyone else. After a while, the journal got inside my head, one person told me. I started thinking about meals differently. It gave me a system for thinking about food without becoming depressed. Something similar happened at Alcoa after O'Neill took over. Just as food journals provided a structure for other habits to flourish, O'Neill's safety habits created an atmosphere in which other behaviors emerged. Early on, O'Neill took the unusual step of ordering Alcoa's OFFICES around the world to link up in an electronic network. This was in the early 1980s, when large, international networks weren't usually connected to people's desktop computers. O'Neill justified his order by arguing that it was essential to create a real-time safety data system that managers could use to share suggestions. As a result, Alcoa developed one of the first genuinely worldwide corporate email systems. O'Neill logged on every morning and sent messages to make sure everyone else was logged on as well. At first, people used the network primarily to discuss safety issues. Then, as email habits became more ingrained and comfortable, they started posting information on all kinds of other topics, such as local market conditions, sales quotas, and business problems. High-ranking executives were required to send in a report every Friday, which anyone in the company could read. A manager in Brazil used the network to send a colleague in New York data on changes in the price of steel. The New Yorker took that information and turned a quick profit for the company on Wall Street. Pretty soon, everyone was using the system to communicate about everything. I would send in my accident report, and I knew everyone else read it, so I figured, why not send pricing information, or intelligence on other companies, one manager told me. It was like we had discovered a secret weapon. The competition couldn't figure out how we were doing it. When the web blossomed, Alcoa was perfectly positioned to take advantage. O'Neill's Keystone habit worker safety had created a platform that encouraged another practice email years ahead of competitors. By 1996, Paul O'Neill had been at Alcoa for almost a decade. His leadership had been studied by the Harvard Business School and the Kennedy School of Government. He was regularly mentioned as a potential Commerce Secretary or Secretary of Defense. His employees and the unions gave him high marks. Under his watch, Alcoa's stock price had risen more than 200%. He was, at last, a universally acknowledged success. In May of that year, at a shareholder meeting in downtown Pittsburgh, a Benedictine nun stood up during the question and answer session and accused O'Neill of lying. Sister Mary Margaret represented a social advocacy group concerned about wages and conditions inside an Alcoa plant in Ciudad Acuña, Mexico. She said that while O'Neill extolled Alcoa's safety measures, workers in Mexico were becoming sick because of dangerous fumes. "It's untrue," O'Neill told the room. On his laptop, he pulled up the safety records from the Mexican plant. "See," he said, showing the room its high scores on safety, environmental compliance, and employee satisfaction surveys. The executive in charge of the facility, Robert Barton, was one of Alcoa's most senior managers. He had been with the company for decades and was responsible for some of their largest partnerships. The nun said that the audience shouldn't trust O'Neill. She sat down. After the meeting, O'Neill asked her to come to his OFFICE. The nun's religious order owned Phi Fty Alcoa shares, and for months they had been asking for a shareholder vote on a resolution to review the company's Mexican operations. O'Neill asked Sister Mary if she had been to any of the plants herself. No, she told him. To be safe, O'Neill asked the company's head of human resources and general counsel to fly to Mexico to see what was going on. When the executives arrived, they poked through the Acuña plant's records and found reports of an incident that had never been sent to headquarters. A few months earlier, there had been a buildup of fumes within a building. It was a relatively minor event. The plant's executive, Barton, had installed ventilators to remove the gases. The people who had become ill had fully recovered within a day or two. But Barton had never reported the illnesses. When the executives returned to Pittsburgh and presented their findings, O'Neill had a question. Did Bob Barton know that people had gotten sick? We didn't meet with him, they answered. But, yeah, it's pretty clear he knew. 2 days later, Barton was red. The exit shocked outsiders. Barton had been mentioned in articles as one of the company's most valuable executives. His departure was a blow to important joint ventures. Within Alcoa, however, no one was surprised. It was seen as an inevitable extension of the culture that O'Neill had built. Barton Fye read himself, one of his colleagues told me. There wasn't even a choice there. This is the final way that Keystone habits encourage widespread change, by creating cultures where new values become ingrained. Keystone habits make tough choices such as firing a top executive easier, because when that person violates the culture, it's clear they have to go. Sometimes these cultures manifest themselves in special vocabularies, the use of which becomes, itself, a habit that defines an organization. At Alcoa, for instance, there were core programs and safety philosophies, phrases that acted like suitcases, containing whole conversations about priorities, goals, and ways of thinking. It might have been hard at another company to fire someone who had been there so long, O'Neill told me. It wasn't hard for me. It was clear what our values dictated. He got fired because he didn't report the incident, and so no one else had the opportunity to learn from it. Not sharing an opportunity to learn is a cardinal sin. Cultures grow out of the keystone habits in every organization, whether leaders are aware of them or not. For instance, when researchers studied an incoming class of cadets at West Point, they measured their grade point averages, physical aptitude, military abilities, and self-discipline. When they correlated those factors with whether students dropped out or graduated, however, they found that all of them mattered less than a factor researchers referred to as grit, which they defined as the tendency to work strenuously toward challenges, maintaining effort and interest over years despite failure, adversity, and plateaus in progress. What's most interesting about grit is how it emerges. It grows out of a culture that cadets create for themselves, and that culture often emerges because of keystone habits they adopt at West Point. There's so much about this school that's hard, one cadet told me. They call the first summer beast barracks, because they want to grind you down. Tons of people quit before the school year starts. But I found this group of guys in the Phi RST couple of days here, and we started this thing where, every morning, we get together to make sure everyone is feeling strong. I go to them if I'm feeling worried or down, and I know they'll pump me back up. There's only 9 of us, and we call ourselves the Musketeers. Without them, I don't think I would have lasted a month here. Cadets who are successful at West Point arrive at the school armed with habits of mental and physical discipline. Those assets, however, only carry you so far. To succeed, they need a keystone habit that creates a culture such as a daily gathering of like-minded friends to help find the strength to overcome obstacles. Keystone habits transform us by creating cultures that make clear the values that, in the heat of a difficult decision or a moment of uncertainty, we might otherwise forget. In 2000, O'Neill retired from Alcoa, and at the request of the newly elected President George W. Bush, became Secretary of the Treasury. He left that post 2 years later, and today spends most of his time teaching hospitals how to focus on worker safety and keystone habits that can lower medical error rates, as well as serving on various corporate boards. Companies and organizations across America, however, have embraced the idea of using keystone habits to remake workplaces. At IBM, for instance, Lou Gerstner rebuilt the firm by initially concentrating on one keystone habit, IBM's research and selling routines. At the consulting firm McKinsey & Company, a culture of continuous improvement is created through a keystone habit of wide-ranging internal critiques that are at the core of every assignment. Within Goldman Sachs, a keystone habit of risk assessment undergirds every decision. And at Alcoa, O'Neill's legacy lives on. Even in his absence, the injury rate has continued to decline. In 2010, 82% of Alcoa locations didn't lose one employee day due to injury, close to an all-time high. On average, workers are more likely to get injured at a software company, animating cartoons for movie studios, or doing taxes as an accountant than handling molten aluminum at Alcoa. When I was made a plant manager, said Jeff Shockey, the Alcoa. O'Neill's tenure at Treasury was not as successful as his career at Alcoa. Almost immediately after taking OFFICE, he began focusing on a couple of key issues, including worker safety, job creation, executive accountability, and guiding African poverty, among other initiatives. However, O'Neill's politics did not line up with those of President Bush, and he launched an internal fight opposing Bush's proposed tax cuts. He was asked to resign at the end of 2002. What I thought was the right thing for economic policy was the opposite of what the White House wanted, O'Neill told me. That's not good for a Treasury Secretary, so I got fired. Executive, the first day I pulled into the parking lot I saw all these parking spaces near the front doors with people's titles on them. The head guy for this or that. People who were important got the best parking spots. The first thing I did was tell a maintenance manager to paint over all the titles. I wanted whoever got to work earliest to get the best spot. Everyone understood the message, every person matters. It was an extension of what Paul was doing around worker safety. It electrified the plant. Pretty soon, everyone was getting to work earlier each day. Starbucks and the habit of success. When willpower becomes automatic. The first time Travis Leach saw his father overdose, he was 9 years old. His family had just moved into a small apartment at the end of an alleyway, the latest in a seemingly endless series of relocations that had most recently caused them to abandon their previous home in the middle of the night, throwing everything they owned into black garbage bags after receiving an eviction notice. Too many people coming and going too late at night, the landlord said. Too much noise. Sometimes, at his old house, Travis would come home from school and find the rooms neatly cleaned, leftovers meticulously wrapped in the fridge and packets of hot sauce and ketchup in Tupperware containers. He knew this meant his parents had temporarily abandoned heroin for crank and spent the day in a cleaning frenzy. Those usually ended badly. Travis felt safer when the house was messy and his parents were on the couch, their eyes half-lidded, watching cartoons. There is no chaos at the end of a heroin fog. Travis's father was a gentleman who loved to cook and, except for a stint in the Navy, spent his entire life within a few miles of his parents in Lodi, California. Travis's mother, by the time everyone moved into the alleyway apartment, was in prison for heroin possession and prostitution. His parents were, essentially, functional addicts and the family maintained a veneer of normalcy. They went camping every summer and on most Friday nights attended his sister and brother's softball games. When Travis was 4 years old, he went to Disneyland with his dad and was photographed for the first time in his life by a Disney employee. The family camera had been sold to a pawn shop years before. On the morning of the overdose, Travis and his brother were playing in the living room on top of blankets they laid out on the floor each night for sleeping. Travis's father was getting ready to make pancakes when he stepped into the bathroom. He was carrying the tube sock that contained his needle, spoon, lighter, and cotton swabs. A few moments later, he came out, opened the refrigerator to get the eggs, and crashed to the floor. When the kids ran around the corner, their father was convulsing, his face turning blue. Travis's siblings had seen an overdose before and knew the drill. His brother rolled him onto his side. His sister opened his mouth to make sure he wouldn't choke on his tongue, and told Travis to run next door, ask to use the neighbor's phone, and dial 911. My name is Travis, my dad is passed out, and we don't know what happened. He's not breathing, Travis lied to the police operator. Even at 9 years old, he knew why his father was unconscious. He didn't want to say it in front of the neighbor. 3 years earlier, one of his dad's friends had died in their basement after shooting up. When the paramedics had taken the body away, neighbors gawked at Travis and his sister while they held the door open for the gurney. One of the neighbors had a cousin whose son was in his class, and soon everyone in school had known. After hanging up the phone, Travis walked to the end of the alleyway and waited for the ambulance. His father was treated at the hospital that morning, charged at the police station in the afternoon, and home again by dinner time. He made spaghetti. Travis turned 10 a few weeks later. When Travis was 16, he dropped out of high school. I was tired of being called a faggot, he said, tired of people following me home and throwing things at me. Everything seemed really overwhelming. It was easier to quit and go somewhere else. He moved 2 hours south, to Fresno, and got a job at a car wash. He was fired for insubordination. He got jobs at McDonald's and Hollywood Video, but when customers were rude, "I wanted ranch dressing, you moron." He would lose control. "Get out of my drive-through," he shouted at one woman, throwing the chicken nuggets at her car before his manager pulled him inside. Sometimes he'd get so upset that he would start crying in the middle of a shift. He was often late, or he'd take a day off for no reason. In the morning, he would yell at his reflection in the mirror, order himself to be better, to suck it up. But he couldn't get along with people, and he wasn't strong enough to weather the steady drip of criticisms and indignities. When the line at his register would get too long and the manager would shout at him, Travis's hands would start shaking and he'd feel like he couldn't catch his breath. He wondered if this is what his parents felt like, so defenseless against life, when they started using drugs. One day, a regular customer at Hollywood Video who'd gotten to know Travis a little bit suggested he think about working at Starbucks. "We're opening a new store on Fort Washington, and I'm going to be an assistant manager," the man said. "You should apply." A month later, Travis was a barista on the morning shift. That was 6 years ago. Today, at 25, Travis is the manager of 2 Starbucks where he oversees 40 employees and is responsible for revenues exceeding $2 million per year. His salary is $44,000 and he has a 401k and no debt. He's never late to work. He does not get upset on the job. When one of his employees started crying after a customer screamed at her, Travis took her aside. "Your apron is a shield," he told her. "Nothing anyone says will ever hurt you. You will always be as strong as you want to be." He picked up that lecture in one of his Starbucks training courses, an education program that began on his first day and continues throughout an employee's career. The program is sufficiently structured that he can earn college credits by completing the modules. The training has, Travis says, changed his life. Starbucks has taught him how to live, how to focus, how to get to work on time, and how to master his emotions. Most crucially, it has taught him willpower. "Starbucks is the most important thing that has ever happened to me," he told me. "I owe everything to this company." For Travis and thousands of others, Starbucks, like a handful of other companies, has succeeded in teaching the kind of life skills that schools, families, and communities have failed to provide. With more than 137,000 current employees and more than 1 million alumni, Starbucks is now, in a sense, one of the nation's largest educators. All of those employees, in their first year alone, spent at least 5 FTY hours in Starbucks classrooms, and dozens more at home with Starbucks workbooks and talking to the Starbucks mentors assigned to them. At the core of that education is an intense focus on an all-important habit, willpower. Dozens of studies show that willpower is the single most important keystone habit for individual success. In a 2005 study, for instance, researchers from the University of Pennsylvania analyzed 164 eighth-grade students, measuring their IQs and other factors, including how much willpower the students demonstrated, as measured by tests of their self-discipline. Students who exerted high levels of willpower were more likely to earn higher grades in their classes and gain admission into more selective schools. They had fewer absences and spent less time watching television and more hours on homework. Highly self-disciplined adolescents outperformed their more impulsive peers on every academic performance variable, the researchers wrote. Self-discipline predicted academic performance more robustly than did IQ. Self-discipline also predicted which students would improve their grades over the course of the school year, whereas IQ did not. Self-discipline has a bigger effect on academic performance than does intellectual talent. And the best way to strengthen willpower and give students a leg up, studies indicate, is to make it into a habit. Sometimes it looks like people with great self-control aren't working hard, but that's because they've made it automatic, Angela Duckworth, one of the University of Pennsylvania researchers, told me. Their willpower occurs without them having to think about it. For Starbucks, willpower is more than an academic curiosity. When the company began plotting its massive growth strategy in the late 1990s, executives recognized that success required cultivating an environment that justified paying $4 for a fancy cup of coffee. The company needed to train its employees to deliver a bit of joy alongside lattes and scones. So early on, Starbucks started researching how they could teach employees to regulate their emotions and marshal their self-discipline to deliver a burst of pep with every serving. Unless baristas are trained to put aside their personal problems, the emotions of some employees will inevitably spill into how they treat customers. However, if a worker knows how to remain focused and disciplined, even at the end of an 8-hour shift, they'll deliver the higher class of fast food service that Starbucks customers expect. The company spent millions of dollars developing curriculums to train employees on self-discipline. Executives wrote workbooks that, in effect, serve as guides to how to make willpower a habit in workers' lives. Those curriculums are, in part, why Starbucks has grown from a sleepy Seattle company into a behemoth with more than 17,000 stores and revenues of more than $10 billion a year. So how does Starbucks do it? How do they take people like Travis, the son of drug addicts and a high school dropout who couldn't muster enough self-control to hold down a job at McDonald's, and teach him to oversee dozens of employees and tens of thousands of dollars in revenue each month? What, precisely, did Travis learn? Everyone who walked into the room where the experiment was being conducted at Case Western Reserve University agreed on one thing: the cookies smelled delicious. They had just come out of the oven and were piled in a bowl, oozing with chocolate chips. On the table next to the cookies was a bowl of radishes. All day long, hungry students walked in, sat in front of the two foods, and submitted, unknowingly, to a test of their willpower that would upend our understanding of how self-discipline works. At the time, there was relatively little academic scrutiny into willpower. Psychologists considered such subjects to be aspects of something they called self-regulation, but it wasn't a field that inspired great curiosity. There was one famous experiment, conducted in the 1960s, in which scientists at Stanford had tested the willpower of a group of 4-year-olds. The kids were brought into a room and presented with a selection of treats, including marshmallows. They were offered a deal: they could eat one marshmallow right away, or, if they waited a few minutes, they could have 2 marshmallows. Then the researcher left the room. Some kids gave in to temptation and ate the marshmallow as soon as the adult left. About 30% managed to ignore their urges, and doubled their treats when the researcher came back 15 minutes later. Scientists, who were watching everything from behind a two-way mirror, kept careful track of which kids had enough self-control to earn the second marshmallow. Years later, they tracked down many of the study's participants. By now, they were in high school. The researchers asked about their grades and SAT scores, ability to maintain friendships, and their capacity to cope with important problems. They discovered that the 4-year-olds who could delay gratify cat-eye the longest ended up with the best grades and with SAT scores 210 points higher, on average, than everyone else. They were more popular and did fewer drugs. If you knew how to avoid the temptation of a marshmallow as a preschooler, it seemed, you also knew how to get yourself to class on time and finish your homework once you got older, as well as how to make friends and resist peer pressure. It was as if the marshmallow ignoring kids had self-regulatory skills that gave them an advantage throughout their lives. Scientists began conducting related experiments, trying to figure out how to help kids increase their self-regulatory skills. They learned that teaching them simple tricks such as distracting themselves by drawing a picture, or imagining a frame around the marshmallow, so it seemed more like a photo and less like a real temptation, helped them learn self-control. By the 1980s, a theory emerged that became generally accepted: willpower is a learnable skill, something that can be taught the same way kids learn to do math and say, "thank you." But funding for these inquiries was scarce. The topic of willpower wasn't in vogue. Many of the Stanford scientists moved on to other areas of research. However, when a group of psychology PhD candidates at Case Western, including one named Mark Muravin, discovered those studies in the mid-90s, they started asking questions the previous research didn't seem to answer. To Raven, this model of Willpower's skill wasn't a satisfying explanation. A skill, after all, is something that remains constant from day to day. If you have the skill to make an omelet on Wednesday, you'll still know how to make it on Friday. In Raven's experience, though, it felt like he forgot how to exert willpower all the time. Some evenings he would come home from work and have no problem going for a jog. Other days, he couldn't do anything besides lie on the couch and watch television. It was as if his brain, or, at least, that part of his brain responsible for making him exercise, had forgotten how to summon the willpower to push him out the door. Some days, he ate healthily. Other days, when he was tired, he raided the vending machines and stuffed himself with candy and chips. If willpower is a skill, Raven wondered, then why doesn't it remain constant from day to day? He suspected there was more to willpower than the earlier experiments had revealed. But how do you test that in a laboratory? Raven's solution was the lab containing 1 bowl of freshly baked cookies and 1 bowl of radishes. The room was essentially a closet with a 2-way mirror, outfitted with a table, a wooden chair, a hand bell, and a toaster oven. 60s even undergraduates were recruited and told to skip a meal. One by one, the undergrads sat in front of the 2 bowls. The point of this experiment is to test taste perceptions, a researcher told each student, which was untrue. The point was to force students, but only some students, to exert their willpower. To that end, half the undergraduates were instructed to eat the cookies and ignore the radishes, the other half were told to eat the radishes and ignore the cookies. Raven's theory was that ignoring cookies is hard. It takes willpower. Ignoring radishes, on the other hand, hardly requires any effort at all. Remember, the researcher said, eat only the food that has been assigned to you. Then she left the room. Once the students were alone, they started munching. The cookie eaters were in heaven. The radish eaters were in agony. They were miserable, forcing themselves to ignore the warm cookies. Through the TWI mirror, the researchers watched one of the radish eaters pick up a cookie, smell it longingly, and then put it back in the bowl. Another grabbed a few cookies, put them down, and then licked melted chocolate off his fingers. After 5 minutes, the researcher re-entered the room. By Raven's estimation, the radish eater's willpower had been thoroughly taxed by eating the bitter vegetable and ignoring the treats. The cookie eaters had hardly used any of their self-discipline. We need to wait about 15 minutes for the sensory memory of the food you ate to fade, the researcher told each participant. To pass the time, she asked them to complete a puzzle. It looked fairly simple: trace a geometric pattern without lifting your pencil from the page or going over the same line twice. If you want to quit, the researcher said, ring the bell. She implied the puzzle wouldn't take long. In truth, the puzzle was impossible to solve. This puzzle wasn't a way to pass time, it was the most important part of the experiment. It took enormous willpower to keep working on the puzzle, particularly when each attempt failed. The scientists wondered, would the students who had already expended their willpower by ignoring the cookies give up on the puzzle faster? In other words, was willpower a finite resource? From behind their TWI mirror, the researchers watched. The cookie eaters, with their unused reservoirs of self-discipline, started working on the puzzle. In general, they looked relaxed. One of them tried a straightforward approach, hit a roadblock, and then started again. And again. And again. Some worked for over half an hour before the researcher told them to stop. On average, the cookie eaters spent almost 19 minutes apiece trying to solve the puzzle before they rang the bell. The radish eaters, with their depleted willpower, acted completely different. They muttered as they worked. They got frustrated. One complained that the whole experiment was a waste of time. Some of them put their heads on the table and closed their eyes. One snapped at the researcher when she came back in. On average, the radish eaters worked for only about 8 minutes, 60% less time than the cookie eaters, before quitting. When the researcher asked afterward how they felt, One of the radish eaters said he was sick of this dumb experiment. By making people use a little bit of their willpower to ignore cookies, we had put them into a state where they were willing to quit much faster, Muraven told me. There's been more than 200 studies on this idea since then, and they've all found the same thing. Willpower isn't just a skill. It's a muscle, like the muscles in your arms or legs, and it gets tired as it works harder, so there's less power left over for other things. Researchers have built on this finding to explain all sorts of phenomena. Some have suggested it helps clarify why otherwise successful people succumb to extramarital affairs, which are most likely to start late at night after a long day of using willpower at work, or why good physicians make dumb mistakes, which most often occur after a doctor has finished a long, complicated task that requires intense focus. If you want to do something that requires willpower, like going for a run after work, you have to conserve your willpower muscle during the day, Muraven told me. If you use it up too early on tedious tasks like writing emails or filing out complicated and boring expense forms, all the strength will be gone by the time you get home. But how far does this analogy extend? Will exercising willpower muscles make them stronger the same way using dumbbells strengthen biceps? In 2006, two Australian researchers, Megan Oaten and Ken Ching, tried to answer the question by creating a willpower workout. They enrolled 24 people between the ages of 18 and 50 in a physical exercise program and, over 2 months, put them through an increasing number of weightlifting, resistance training, and aerobic routines. Week after week, people forced themselves to exercise more frequently, using more and more willpower each time they hit the gym. After 2 months, the researchers scrutinized the rest of the participants' lives to see if increased willpower at the gym resulted in greater willpower at home. Before the experiment began, most of the subjects were self-professed couch potatoes. Now, of course, they were in better physical shape. But they were also healthier in other parts of their lives, as well. The more time they spent at the gym, the fewer cigarettes they smoked and the less alcohol, caffeine, and junk food they consumed. They were spending more hours on homework and fewer watching TV. They were less depressed. Maybe, Oaten and Ching wondered, those results had nothing to do with willpower. What if exercise just makes people happier and less hungry for fast food? So they designed another experiment. This time, they signed up 20 people for a FRM-month money management program. They set savings goals and asked participants to deny themselves luxuries, such as meals at restaurants or movies. Participants were asked to keep detailed logs of everything they bought, which was annoying at first, but eventually people worked up the self-discipline to jot down every purchase. People's finances improved as they progressed through the program. More surprising, they also smoked fewer cigarettes and drank less alcohol and caffeine, on average, 2 fewer cups of coffee, 2 fewer beers, and, among smokers, 15 fewer cigarettes each day. They ate less junk food and were more productive at work and school. It was like the exercise study, as people strengthened their willpower muscles in one part of their lives, in the gym, or a money management program, that strength spilled over into what they ate or how hard they worked. Once willpower became stronger, it touched everything. Oaten and Ching did one more experiment. They enrolled 45 VE students in an academic improvement program that focused on creating study habits. Predictably, participants' learning skills improved. And the students also smoked less, drank less, watched less television, exercised more, and ate healthier, even though all those things were never mentioned in the academic program. Again, as their willpower muscles strengthened, good habits seemed to spill over into other parts of their lives. When you learn to force yourself to go to the gym or start your homework or eat a salad instead of a hamburger, part of what's happening is that you're changing how you think, said Todd Heatherton, a researcher at Dartmouth who has worked on willpower studies. People get better at regulating their impulses. They learn how to distract themselves from temptations. And once you've gotten into that willpower groove, your brain is practiced at helping you focus on a goal. There are now hundreds of researchers, at nearly every major university, studying willpower. public and charter schools in Philadelphia, Seattle, New York, and elsewhere have started incorporating Willpower strengthening lessons into curriculums. At KIP, or the Knowledge is Power program, a collection of charter schools serving low-income students across the nation, teaching self-control is part of the school's philosophy. A KIP school in Philadelphia gave students shirts proclaiming, "Don't eat the marshmallow." Many of these schools have dramatically raised students' test scores. That's why signing kids up for piano lessons or sports is so important. It has nothing to do with creating a good musician or a 5-year-old soccer star, said Heatherton. When you learn to force yourself to practice for an hour or run 15 laps, you start building self-regulatory strength. A 5-year-old who can follow the ball for 10 minutes becomes a 6th grader who can start his homework on time. As research on willpower has become a hot topic in scientific journals and newspaper articles, it has started to trickle into corporate America. Firms such as Starbucks, A&D The Gap, Walmart, restaurants, or any other business that relies on entry-level workers all face a common problem. No matter how much their employees want to do a great job, many will fail because they lack self-discipline. They show up late. They snap at rude customers. They get distracted or drawn into workplace dramas. They quit for no reason. For a lot of employees, Starbucks is their first professional experience, said Christine Deputy, who helped oversee the company's training programs for more than a decade. If your parents or teachers have been telling you what to do your entire life, and suddenly customers are yelling and your boss is too busy to give you guidance, it can be really overwhelming. A lot of people can't make the transition. So we try to figure out how to give our employees the self-discipline they didn't learn in high school. But when companies like Starbucks tried to apply the willpower lessons gleaned from the radish and cookie and exercise studies to the workplace, they encountered difficulties. They sponsored weight loss classes and offered employees free gym memberships, hoping the benefits would spill over to how they served coffee. Attendance was spotty. It was hard to sit through a class or hit the gym after a full day at work, employees complained. If someone has trouble with self-discipline at work, they're probably also going to have trouble attending a program designed to strengthen their self-discipline after work, Muraven said. But Starbucks was determined to solve this problem. By 2007, during the height of its expansion, the company was opening 7 new stores every day and hiring as many as 1,500 employees each week. Training them to excel at customer service, to show up on time and not get angry at patrons and serve everyone with a smile while remembering customers' orders and, if possible, their names, was essential. People expect an expensive latte delivered with a bit of sparkle. We're not in the coffee business serving people, Howard Behar, the former president of Starbucks, told me. We're in the people business serving coffee. Our entire business model is based on fantastic customer service. Without that, we're toast. The solution, Starbucks discovered, was turning self-discipline into an organizational habit. In 1992, a British psychologist walked into 2 of Scotland's busiest orthopedic hospitals and recruited 5 dozen patients for an experiment she hoped would explain how to boost the willpower of people exceptionally resistant to change. The patients, on average, were 68 years old. Most of them earned less than $10,000 a year and didn't have more than a high school degree. All of them had recently undergone hip or knee replacement surgeries, but because they were relatively poor and uneducated, many had waited years for their operations. They were retirees, elderly mechanics, and store clerks. They were in life's final chapters, and most had no desire to pick up a new book. Recovering from a hip or knee surgery is incredibly arduous. The operation involves severing joint muscles and sawing through bones. While recovering, the smallest movements, shifting in bed or flexing a joint, can be excruciating. However, it is essential that patients begin exercising almost as soon as they wake from surgery. They must begin moving their legs and hips before the muscles and skin have healed, or scar tissue will clog the joint, destroying its flexibility. In addition, if patients don't start exercising, they risk developing blood clots. But the agony is so extreme that it's not unusual for people to skip out on rehab sessions. Patients, particularly elderly ones, often refuse to comply with doctors' orders. The Scottish study's participants were the types of people most likely to fail at rehabilitation. The scientist conducting the experiment wanted to see if it was possible to help them harness their willpower. She gave each patient a booklet after their surgeries that detailed their rehab schedule, and in the back were 13 additional pages, one for each week, with blank spaces and instructions. My goals for this week are _. Write down exactly what you are going to do. For example, if you are going to go for a walk this week, write down where and when you are going to walk. She asked patients to fill in each of those pages with specify C plans. Then she compared the recoveries of those who wrote out goals with those of another set of patients who had received the same booklets, but didn't write anything. It seems absurd to think that giving people a few pieces of blank paper might make a difference in how quickly they recover from surgery. But when the researcher visited the patients 3 months later, she found a striking difference between the two groups. The patients who had written plans in their booklets had started walking almost twice as fast as the ones who had not. They had started getting in and out of their chairs, unassisted, almost 3 times as fast. They were putting on their shoes, doing the laundry, and making themselves meals quicker than the patients who hadn't scribbled out goals ahead of time. The psychologist wanted to understand why. She examined the booklets, and discovered that most of the blank pages had been filled in with specify C, detailed plans about the most mundane aspects of recovery. One patient, for example, had written, I will walk to the bus stop tomorrow to meet my wife from work, and then noted what time he would leave, the route he would walk, what he would wear, which coat he would bring if it was raining, and what pills he would take if the pain became too much. Another patient, in a similar study, wrote a series of very specify C schedules regarding the exercises he would do each time he went to the bathroom. A third wrote a minute-by-minute itinerary for walking around the block. As the psychologist scrutinized the booklets, she saw that many of the plans had something in common. They focused on how patients would handle a specify C moment of anticipated pain. The man who exercised on the way to the bathroom, for instance, knew that each time he stood up from the couch, the ache was excruciating. So he wrote out a plan for dealing with it, automatically take the first step, right away, so he wouldn't be tempted to sit down again. The patient who met his wife at the bus stop dreaded the afternoons, because that stroll was the longest and most painful each day. So he detailed every obstacle he might confront, and came up with a solution ahead of time. Put another way, the patient's plans were built around INFL action points when they knew their pain, and thus the temptation to quit would be strongest. The patients were telling themselves how they were going to make it over the hump. Each of them, intuitively, employed the same rules that Claude Hopkins had used to sell Pepsodent. They identify simple cues and obvious rewards. The man who met his wife at the bus stop, for instance, identify an easy CUE, it's 3:30, she's on her way home, and he clearly defined his are you it, honey, I'm here. When the temptation to give up halfway through the walk appeared, the patient could ignore it because he had crafted self-discipline into a habit. There's no reason why the other patients, the ones who didn't write out recovery plans, couldn't have behaved the same way. All the patients had been exposed to the same admonitions and warnings at the hospital. They all knew exercise was essential for their recovery. They all spent weeks in rehab. But the patients who didn't write out any plans were at a significant disadvantage, because they never thought ahead about how to deal with painful inflection points. They never deliberately designed willpower habits. Even if they intended to walk around the block, their resolve abandoned them when they confronted the agony of the first few steps. When Starbucks' attempts at boosting workers' willpower through gym memberships and diet workshops faltered, executives decided they needed to take a new approach. They started by looking more closely at what was actually happening inside their stores. They saw that, like the Scottish patients, their workers were failing when they ran up against inflection points. What they needed were institutional habits that made it easier to muster their self-discipline. Executives determined that, in some ways, they had been thinking about willpower all wrong. Employees with willpower lapses, it turned out, had no difficulty doing their jobs most of the time. On the average day, a willpower-challenged worker was no different from anyone else. But sometimes, particularly when faced with unexpected stresses or uncertainties, those employees would snap and their self-control would evaporate. A customer might begin yelling. For instance, and a normally calm employee would lose her composure. An impatient crowd might overwhelm a barista, and suddenly he was on the edge of tears. What employees really needed were clear instructions about how to deal with INFL action points, something similar to the Scottish Patience booklets, a routine for employees to follow when their willpower muscles went limp. So the company developed new training materials that spelled out routines for employees to use when they hit rough patches. The manuals taught workers how to respond to specific cues, such as a screaming customer or a long line at a cash register. Managers drilled employees, role-playing with them until the responses became automatic. The company specify C rewards, a grateful customer, praise from a manager, that employees could look to as evidence of a job well done. Starbucks taught their employees how to handle moments of adversity by giving them willpower habit loops. When Travis started at Starbucks, for instance, his manager introduced him to the habits right away. One of the hardest things about this job is dealing with an angry customer, Travis's manager told him. When someone comes up and starts yelling at you because they got the wrong drink, what's your first reaction? I don't know, Travis said. I guess I feel kind of scared. Or angry. That's natural, his manager said. But our job is to provide the best customer service, even when the pressure's on. The manager flipped open the Starbucks manual and showed Travis a page that was largely blank. At the top, it read, "When a customer is unhappy, my plan is to." This workbook is for you to imagine unpleasant situations and write out a plan for responding, the manager said. One of the systems we use is called the latte method. We listen to the customer, acknowledge their complaint, take action by solving the problem, thank them, and then explain why the problem occurred. Why don't you take a few minutes and write out a plan for dealing with an angry customer? Use the latte method. Then we can role-play a little bit. Starbucks has dozens of routines that employees are taught to use during stressful INFL action points. There's the what-why system of giving criticism and the connect, discover, and respond system for taking orders when things become hectic. There are learned habits to help baristas tell the difference between patrons who just want their coffee, a hurried customer speaks with a sense of urgency and may seem impatient or look at their watch, and those who need a bit more coddling. A regular customer knows other baristas by name and normally orders the same beverage each day. Throughout the training manuals are dozens of blank pages where employees can write out plans that anticipate how they will surmount INFL action points. Then they practice those plans, again and again, until they become automatic. This is how willpower becomes a habit, by choosing a certain behavior ahead of time, and then following that routine when an INFL action point arrives. When the Scottish Patience let out their booklets, or Travis studied the latte method, they decided ahead of time how to react to a painful muscle or an angry customer. When the cue arrived, the routine occurred. Starbucks isn't the only company to use such training methods. For instance, at Deloitte Consulting, the largest tax and financial services company in the world, employees are trained in a curriculum named Moments That Matter, which focuses on dealing with INFL action points such as when a client complains about fees, when a colleague is fired, or when a Deloitte consultant has made a mistake. For each of those moments, there are pre-programmed routines. Get curious, say what no one else will, apply the 5/5/5 rule that guide employees in how they should respond. At the Container Store, employees receive more than 185 hours of training in their first year alone. They are taught to recognize INFL action points such as an angry coworker or an overwhelmed customer, and habits such as routines for calming shoppers or defusing a confrontation. When a customer comes in who seems overwhelmed, for example, an employee immediately asks them to visualize the space in their home they are hoping to organize, and describe how they'll feel when everything is in its place. We've had customers come up to us and say, "This is better than a visit to my shrink," the company's CEO told a reporter. Howard Schultz, the man who built Starbucks into a colossus, isn't so different from Travis in some ways. He grew up in a public housing project in Brooklyn, sharing a two-bedroom apartment with his parents and two siblings. When he was 7 years old, Schultz's father broke his ankle and lost his job driving a diaper truck. That was all it took to throw the family into crisis. His father, after his ankle healed, began cycling through a series of lower-paying jobs. "My dad never found his way," Schultz told me. "I saw his self-esteem get battered. I felt like there was so much more he could have accomplished." Schultz's school was a wild, overcrowded place with asphalt playgrounds and kids playing football, basketball, softball, punchball, slapball, and any other game they could devise. If your team lost, it could take an hour to get another turn. So Schultz made sure his team always won, no matter the cost. He would come home with bloody scrapes on his elbows and knees, which his mother would gently rinse with a wet cloth. "You don't quit," she told him. His competitiveness earned him a college football scholarship. He broke his jaw and never played a game, a communications degree, and eventually a job as a Xerox salesman in New York City. He'd wake up every morning, go to a new Midtown OFFICE building, take the elevator to the top floor, and go to politely inquiring if anyone was interested in toner or copy machines. Then he'd ride the elevator down one floor and start all over again. By the early 1980s, Schultz was working for a plastics manufacturer when he noticed that a little-known retailer in Seattle was ordering an inordinate number of coffee drip cones. Schultz flew out and fell in love with the company. 2 years later, when he heard that Starbucks, then just 6 stores, was for sale, he asked everyone he knew for money and bought it. That was 1987. Within 3 years, there were 84 stores. Within 6 years, more than 1,000. Today, there are 17,000 stores in more than 50 countries. Why did Schultz turn out so different from all the other kids on that playground? Some of his old classmates today are cops and fiery men in Brooklyn. Others are in prison. Schultz is worth more than $1 billion. He's been heralded as one of the greatest CEOs of the 20th century. Where did he find the determination, the willpower to climb from a housing project to a private jet? "I don't really know," he told me. "My mom always said, you're going to be the first person to go to college, you're going to be a professional, you're going to make us all proud." She would ask these little questions: how are you going to study tonight? What are you going to do tomorrow? How do you know you're ready for your test? It trained me to set goals. "I've been really lucky," he said. "And I really, genuinely believe that if you tell people that they have what it takes to succeed, they'll prove you right." Schultz's focus on employee training and customer service made Starbucks into one of the most successful companies in the world. For years, he was personally involved in almost every aspect of how the company was run. In 2000, exhausted, he handed over day-to-day operations to other executives, at which point, Starbucks began to stumble. Within a few years, customers were complaining about the quality of the drinks and customer service. Executives, focused on a frantic expansion, often ignored the complaints. Employees grew unhappy. Surveys indicated people were starting to equate Starbucks with tepid coffee and empty smiles. So Schultz stepped back into the chief executive position in 2008. Among his priorities was restructuring the company's training program to renew its focus on a variety of issues, including bolstering employees, or partners, in Starbucks lingo, willpower and self-confidence. "We had to start earning customer and partner trust again," Schultz told me. At about the same time, a new wave of studies was appearing that looked at the science of willpower in a slightly different way. Researchers had noticed that some people, like Travis, were able to create willpower habits relatively easily. Others, however, struggled, no matter how much training and support they received. What was causing the difference? Mark Muravin, who was by then a professor at the University of Albany, set up a new experiment. He put undergraduates in a room that contained a plate of warm, fresh cookies and asked them to ignore the treats. Half the participants were treated kindly. "We ask that you please don't eat the cookies." "Is that okay?" a researcher said. She then discussed the purpose of the experiment, explaining that it was to measure their ability to resist temptations. She thanked them for contributing their time. "If you have any suggestions or thoughts about how we can improve this experiment, please let me know. We want you to help us make this experience as good as possible." The other half of the participants weren't coddled the same way. They were simply given orders. "You must not eat the cookies," the researcher told them. She didn't explain the experiment's goals, compliment them, or show any interest in their feedback. She told them to follow the instructions. "We'll start now," she said. The students from both groups had to ignore the warm cookies for 5 minutes after the researcher left the room. None gave in to temptation. Then the researcher returned. She asked each student to look at a computer monitor. It was programmed to flash numbers on the screen, one at a time, 4 500 milliseconds apiece. The participants were asked to hit the space bar every time they saw a 6 followed by a 4. This has become a standard way to measure willpower. Paying attention to a boring sequence of flashing numbers requires a focus akin to working on an impossible puzzle. Students who had been treated kindly did well on the computer test. Whenever a 6 flashed and a 4 followed, they pounced on the space bar. They were able to maintain their focus for the entire 12 minutes. Despite ignoring the cookies, they had willpower to spare. Students who had been treated rudely, on the other hand, did terribly. They kept forgetting to hit the space bar. They said they were tired and couldn't focus. Their willpower muscle, researchers determined, had been fatigued by the brusque instructions. When Muravin started exploring why students who had been treated kindly had more willpower, he found that the key difference was the sense of control they had over their experience. "We found this again and again," Muravin told me. "When people are asked to do something that takes self-control, if they think they are doing it for personal reasons, if they feel like it's a choice or something they enjoy because it helps someone else, it's much less taxing. If they feel like they have no autonomy, if they're just following orders, their willpower muscles get tired much faster." In both cases, people ignored the cookies. But when the students were treated like cogs, rather than people, it took a lot more willpower. For companies and organizations, this insight has enormous implications. Simply giving employees a sense of agency, a feeling that they are in control, that they have genuine decision-making authority, can radically increase how much energy and focus they bring to their jobs. One 2010 study at a manufacturing plant in Ohio, for instance, scrutinized assembly line workers who were empowered to make small decisions about their schedules and work environment. They designed their own uniforms and had authority over shifts. Nothing else changed. All the manufacturing processes and pay scales stayed the same. Within 2 months, productivity at the plant increased by 20%. Workers were taking shorter breaks. They were making fewer mistakes. Giving employees a sense of control improved how much self-discipline they brought to their jobs. The same lessons hold true at Starbucks. Today, the company is focused on giving employees a greater sense of authority. They have asked workers to redesign how espresso machines and cash registers are laid out, to decide for themselves how customers should be greeted and where merchandise should be displayed. It's not unusual for a store manager to spend hours discussing with his employees where a blender should be located. We've started asking partners to use their intellect and creativity, rather than telling them, "Take the coffee out of the box, put the cup here, follow this rule," said Chris Engskov, a vice president at Starbucks. People want to be in control of their lives. Turnover has gone down. Customer satisfaction is up. Since Schultz's return, Starbucks has boosted revenues by more than $1.2 billion per year. When Travis was 16, before he dropped out of school and started working for Starbucks, his mother told him a story. They were driving together, and Travis asked why he didn't have more siblings. His mother had always tried to be completely honest with her children, and so she told him that she had become pregnant 2 years before Travis was born but had gotten an abortion. They already had 2 children at that point, she explained, and were addicted to drugs. They didn't think they could support another baby. Then, a year later, she became pregnant with Travis. She thought about having another abortion, but it was too much to bear. It was easier to let nature take its course. Travis was born. She told me that she had made a lot of mistakes, but that having me was one of the best things that ever happened to her, Travis said. When your parents are addicts, you grow up knowing you can't always trust them for everything you need. But I've been really lucky to find bosses who gave me what was missing. If my mom had been as lucky as me, I think things would have turned out different for her. A few years after that conversation, Travis's father called to say that an infection had entered his mother's bloodstream through one of the places on her arm she used to shoot up. Travis immediately drove to the hospital in Lodi, but she was unconscious by the time he arrived. She died a half-hour later, when they removed her life support. A week later, Travis's father was in the hospital with pneumonia. His lung had collapsed. Travis drove to Lodi again, but it was 8:02 p.m. when he got to the emergency room. A nurse brusquely told him he'd have to come back tomorrow. Visiting hours were over. Travis has thought a lot about that moment since then. He hadn't started working at Starbucks yet. He hadn't learned how to control his emotions. He didn't have the habits that, since then, he's spent years practicing. When he thinks about his life now, how far he is from a world where overdoses occur and stolen cars show up in driveways and a nurse seems like an insurmountable obstacle, he wonders how it's possible to travel such a long distance in such a short time. If he had died a year later, everything would have been different, Travis told me. By then, he would have known how to calmly plead with the nurse. He would have known to acknowledge her authority, and then ask politely for one small exception. He could have gotten inside the hospital. Instead, he gave up and walked away. I said, all I want to do is talk to him once, and she was like, he's not even awake, it's after visiting hours, come back tomorrow. I didn't know what to say. I felt so small. Travis's father died that night. On the anniversary of his death, every year, Travis wakes up early, takes an extra long shower, plans out his day in careful detail, and then drives to work. He always arrives on time.